Hey everyone, ready to dive into some fascinating math concepts. Today we are taking a deep dive into TMM, complex comparison, week 3 from scholars and socials.
So it's all about making connections, right? Connecting the dots between arithmetic and geometry and algebra.
Okay, a thought.
And the key to making those connections is comparison.
Comparison, you mean like comparing numbers, like which number is bigger or smaller?
Well, it starts with that, but it gets so much bigger literally. Think back to when you first learned about dimensions.
Okay, like 1D, 2D, 3D.
Exactly. It all starts with a point, right?
Okay, a dot on a piece of paper.
And that point, that dot, it has 0 dimensions because it doesn't have any length or width or height.
But then things get interesting when we start comparing that dot to other points. Because when we connect those dots,
We get a line.
our first dimension.
And if you connect lines, you get 2D shapes.
And if you stack those shapes, you get 3 dimensions, which is the world we experience every day. So it all builds from comparing points. And the same goes for numbers, or the number line.
Oh, yeah, from elementary school.
Well, it's not just for kids. It's a visual representation of different number systems. So you start with your counting numbers.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, and so on.
Those are our natural numbers, the ones we learned first.
And then we realize, hey, we need a 0 in there. And what about numbers less than 0?
The negative numbers.
And bam, we have our integers.
And we can see all of that on the number line.
Exactly. It's a way to visually compare those numbers and see where they fall in relation to each other.
We're not just comparing sizes anymore, but types of numbers, positions.
And it gets even more interesting when we start bringing fractions into the mix, because now we're not just comparing whole numbers, but parts of a whole.
So comparing half a pizza to 3/4 of a pizza.
You got it. And with each new number system, our mathematical toolbox expands. We gain more precision, more nuance, and ultimately a deeper understanding of how numbers work.
This is way cooler than how I learned math in school. We're actually uncovering the why behind the what now. So we're bridging the gap between the concrete and the abstract.
And it's really cool when you start thinking about how these geometric concepts, the points, the lines, they all connect back to numbers in a really tangible way.
I'm starting to see that, yeah.
Remember how we were talking about the number line?
Yeah, and how it shows us different number systems.
Well, it's also the perfect tool for understanding concepts like absolute value and inequalities.
Okay, now those are 2 concepts I wouldn't mind revisiting because honestly, absolute value always kind of confused me.
Really? What if I told you it's just about measuring distance?
Distance? How so?
It's simply the distance a number is from 0 on the number line. So like both 5 and -5 have an absolute value of 5 because they're both 5 units away from 0, just in opposite directions.
Oh, that's a much clearer explanation than I got in school. It's not just some random operation, it actually means something.
Exactly. It's all about relationships and comparisons.
And what about inequalities? How does the number line help with those?
Remember those symbols, less than and greater than.
Yeah, those always trip me up.
On the number line, super simple. Numbers to the right are always greater than numbers to the left.
Wow, that's so obvious now that you say it.
Sometimes a visual representation is all it takes.
This is what I love about this deep dive. We're uncovering all these hidden connections I never realized were there. Suddenly, math feels way more intuitive.
Exactly. And speaking of connections, have you heard of the Math Domain Challenge?
It rings a bell, but I'm not sure. What is it?
It's this idea that you can't just rely on one area of math to solve a problem. You have to pull from arithmetic, geometry, and algebra all at the same time.
Whoa, that sounds intense, like a math triathlon or something.
It is, but it's also incredibly rewarding because it forces you to see the interconnectedness of mathematical concepts.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine you're trying to find the perimeter of a rectangle. Now, you could use geometry and just plug in the length and width into the perimeter formula. But what if you brought in some algebra? You could set up an equation to represent the relationship between the sides and solve for an unknown side length.
That's so cool. It's like we're using different tools from our mathematical toolbox to approach the problem from multiple angles.
And that's the beauty of the Math Domain Challenge. It helps you develop a more holistic and flexible understanding of math.
This reminds me of something you mentioned earlier about how this document we're looking at is like a decoder ring for the Classical Conversations Math Map curriculum. Can you tell me more about that?
Sure. The Math Map is this super cool visual tool that organizes different math concepts by their dimensions. So you might have points and numbers in 0 dimensions, lines and number lines in 1 dimension, and so on.
So we're taking all these different areas of math and organizing them visually based on dimensions.
But it's more than just organization. It's about seeing the connections between those areas.
Like how a point connects to a line and a line connects to a shape and so on.
You got it. And it doesn't stop at 2 dimensions. It goes all the way up, encompassing all those more complex mathematical concepts you might encounter later on.
I do have one question. How does this idea of comparison, which seems so simple, apply to some of those really complex concepts? Like, what about limits? How can comparison help us understand something like that? It's like trying to understand infinity.
Well, think of it this way. Imagine you're walking towards a wall, but with each step, you only cover half the remaining distance.
Okay, so I'm getting closer to the wall, but never actually reaching it.
You got it. And that's the basic idea behind a limit. We're comparing the distance we've covered to the remaining distance, and we're seeing what happens as that remaining distance gets smaller and smaller, approaching zero.
So we're comparing these infinitely small values.
And it all comes back to that fundamental concept of comparison. It allows us to make sense of these infinite processes and see how they play out in a finite world.
And to think, we started with just comparing dots on a page.
And now we're talking about infinity. It just goes to show you how powerful this idea of comparison really is. It's not just some basic math skill. It's a fundamental way of thinking.
I'm curious, how does this idea of comparison, which we've been exploring in the context of math, apply to our everyday lives? We don't walk around measuring angles and calculating limits all day, or do we?
Well, we might not be doing it consciously, but we're actually using comparison all the time.
Yeah.
Think about making a decision, any decision, like what to have for dinner.
Okay, so I'm comparing pizza to tacos. Classic dilemma.
You're weighing different factors, maybe the taste, the nutritional value, how much effort it takes to make.
Or how much each option costs.
You're using comparison to make a judgment call based on the information you have.
And I do that with pretty much every decision, big or small.
And in a way, that's kind of what we do in math too. We gather information, we make comparisons, and we draw conclusions based on those comparisons.
So this math map we've been talking about, it's not just about understanding abstract concepts. It's about giving us a framework for thinking critically in all aspects of our lives.
Precisely. It's about developing those critical thinking skills that help us navigate a complex world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of mathematical comparison, what's one final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
I'd say don't underestimate the power of comparison. Whether you're solving a math problem or just trying to make sense of the world around you, comparison is a powerful tool that can help you unlock new levels of understanding and insight.